Hello and welcome to the live webinar Cracking the Code, Building DPDPA-Compliant Applications for India's Tech Ecosystem. I am Nida Farheen, your host for today's webinar. Today's episode is all about the Digital Personal Data Protection Act of 2023, or henceforth DPDPA, one of the most transformative legislation of our country shaping our digital ecosystem. In today's webinar, we'll be diving deep into the intricate world of data privacy and security tailored for the Indian tech industry. I'm thrilled to be joined by a distinguished guest who needs no introduction in the cybersecurity world, Mr. Vishal Salvi, the Chief Executive Officer at Quick Heal Technologies Limited. Welcome and honored to have you, sir.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Mr. Salvi is widely recognized as a global leader with substantial management and domain expertise with over 3 decades of experience in cybersecurity and risk management. He has previously held leadership roles at PwC, Infosys, and HDFC Bank, shaping their cybersecurity frameworks and policies. As an active member of several advisory councils and boards, Mr. Salvi provides leadership and guidance on various cybersecurity issues and has been instrumental in advising policymakers and businesses on compliance strategies, including and navigating the intricacies of DPDPA. He has also served as an independent director of the Data Security Council of India. Under his guidance, Quick Heal has advanced innovative solutions to protect enterprises and individuals in an ever-evolving threat landscape. Over the years, he's been honored with numerous industry recognitions, awards from esteemed institutions such as DSCI, CSO Forum, and ISACA. Mr. Salvi, thank you again for joining us. We are thrilled to hear from you, gain insights from you.
Thank you.
Today's webinar will not just be a techno-legal conversation, we'll also unravel how the DPDPA impacts developers, IT industry professionals, and tech businesses, exploring everything from consent management and data minimization to cross-border data transfers and privacy by design principle. So grab a coffee. Let's decode how this act is going to redefine India's digital tech landscape. We'll also be addressing your questions during the live webinar, so please do leave them in our live chat box as we go along. So let's get started off. How would you say that the DPDPA would actually impact the Indian tech landscape in the future years to come?
Yeah, so I think there is a rapid rise of digital adoption, not just globally, but here in India. The India digital stack, the way in terms of how the global companies are setting up their back office in India, and so much of adoption of technology which is happening in India. I think it's very important that we have governance around how we look at privacy and cybersecurity of this information. So when you talk about how that governance comes in, it comes in the form of various regulations, and you have seen all over the world that there have been multiple regulations which have come in Europe, in US, and different parts of the world. And I think it was time that we have something of that nature in India as well. And so the fact that DPDP is now an act, and we should expect the enforcement coming out soon, it's very opportune. It is the right time for us to have a governance around this topic, which will give assurance not just to the citizens of the country, but also to the globe, that India is very serious about how we look at privacy of information and data.
Absolutely. So let's get started with a concept that took center stage during the COVID-19 pandemic, data anonymization. In public health initiatives like Arogya Setu, anonymization was critical in balancing privacy and utility. But what does anonymization mean under the DPDPA, and what steps should Indian organizations take to ensure compliance?
When you talk about anonymization, I think it is a very important aspect of privacy. And what it really means is that you remove all the personal identifiable information from the data set so that it cannot be attributed to an individual or group of individuals. And so it becomes a very important part of your strategy to implement privacy and especially the provisions of DPDP. And there are various techniques and various methods by which you can do that, but essentially it is going to be a very important aspect of how we look at privacy and its implementation.
All right, that's a fascinating dive into anonymization. So now let's shift gears to something that impacts every digital user in India, consent. Have you ever stopped to think how apps manage the permissions you give them as soon as you install them? Let's find out. So, sir, with DPDPA emphasizing consent management, what workflows can Indian companies implement, in their systems to give users full control over their data while staying compliant?
Yeah, so I think consent management is a very fundamental and important aspect of privacy, but also it's a very tough and very difficult control to implement. And the reason is because obviously there are aspects in terms of awareness of users, in terms of making them understand their rights and how to actually exercise their right in consent management. Number two, in terms of what is the technology options available and how we provide those options in front of the users. And number three, how do you then integrate all these different aspects of consents that we receive from the end users into the solutions that we have implemented. And so therefore there is also a back-end task of getting the whole ecosystem ready to understand how that integration happens to ensure that the whole life cycle of consent management is implemented. So I think that's really what it is. And in my view, you have to make a start. It's going to be a journey when it comes to its implementation. Actually, it's the case with any privacy aspect that you want to implement. It is always going to be a journey. It's not going to be that today you implement it, tomorrow you'll be 100% compliant. So you have to start that journey, and it's the same thing with consent, where you need to make sure that you understand, you build frameworks, you build policies, and you also build awareness so that every aspect of the request from a user, and now, so this is the back-end part, but I think in fundamentally what consent management is giving the power of controlling the information, your own personal identifiable information that you are entrusting on a third party, or whether it's a bank or whether it's your service provider or your social media platform. You control how that information is used, and you control its whole life cycle in terms of erasing it, deleting it, and also giving additional consent in terms of how it has to be further used within that third party.
Absolutely, yes. So consent is only one piece of the puzzle. Let's talk about something we hope never happens, but must be prepared for: data breaches. Imagine a scenario where a fintech startup experiences a breach, exposing sensitive customer data. So, sir, in such a scenario, what does the DPDPA prescribe in case of data breaches, and how should companies effectively respond, notify the affected parties, or ensure compliance effectively, and what sort of real-time implementation can they have in their development lifecycle of the software?
Yeah, so I think one important aspect that we need to understand here is that cybersecurity breach response and privacy breach response are, related cousins. They need to work hand in glove. And it's the same process of a breach response that you would adopt for any cyber breach that you would actually adopt for a privacy breach. In fact, most of the privacy breaches will have a cyber component to it. So therefore, I would say when you talk about incident response, you would actually fall back on your cyber resiliency response when it comes to breach response readiness. The only difference is that because apart from the Chief Information Security Officer, you also have a data privacy officer, and they are two different individuals or departments within a given organization. You would also have to dovetail the breach response related when it comes to privacy related obligations in terms of communications and controls and containment to along with your DPO office, so that that whole response becomes coordinated response. Now, so when you look at, that's a fundamental level, how you define the process and how you work together. And then after that, when you look at the actual steps required, it's all about initial containment, then recovery, then your communication response, and then, obviously assessment, analysis, investigation, root cause analysis, and remediation, and, finally recovering back the services. But in case of privacy, you will also have litigations and legal aspects of responses to customers and other things which will come into play. I think the very important aspect of, apart from all of these technical aspects of resilience, is the act of making sure that there is a proper response or communication which happens to regulators. For example, communication to a certain or communication to SEBI, which are already there and enforced. But I'm assuming that with DPDP, there would be certain expectations of communicating on breaches and privacy-related aspects to a government body. So all of those need to be complied to in a timely manner so that you are not, you're complying to your obligations and you're not in violations with any of those.
Absolutely. So could you break down on the workflow that is essential for automating these notifications or managing incident response? Could you take a little bit more deeper dive into this?
I think the first important aspect that you need to get it right is in terms of how you do your tabletop exercises. How do you plan for these different scenarios, and what kind of playbooks you have created within your organization across different stakeholders, because you have your IT team, you have your HR team, legal team, your corporate communications team, your CISO team, your DPO team. So there are so many different stakeholders, and if in a situation of a crisis or an incident, people need to know what their roles are, and they need to train themselves and play and exercise these roles so that that playbook get tested. Not only that, depending on different scenarios, what is the policy decision that your organization or your leadership is going to take in terms of communication? What are your contractual obligations for communication to your customers? What are your legal obligations in terms of your communication to different law and enforcement bodies and governments and organizations? All of that needs to be understood, and accordingly you define your playbooks which are to be made and put in place, and then you test it out. So when actually the scenario unfolds, you're fully ready to execute it. I think that's one thing which is important. There are certain aspects of technical response which can be automated, or at least you have necessary tools, solutions, and service providers on a standby or on retainer basis so that they can actually be called in when a situation arises. So that, because, chain of custody and making sure there is a forensic evidence and proper, control over how that information is protected, how the status of that particular incident is protected is very, very critical. But apart from that, you also need to go beyond that in terms of having a legal retainer to advise you in terms of how you need to comply. Especially if you're a global company, then you will also have to comply to different regulations across the globe. And each country has different laws, and depending on that, how you comply and what you need to do country by country is also something that you need to get a real-time advice when a particular incident happens. So you need to put all of this in place before the incident happens, because you cannot do it on a trial and error basis. So that's really what you need to do in terms of your preparation, the detail in terms of preparation for an incident like this.
Absolutely. So actually, moving on to that, building on that actually, how would you, talk about the context, in the context of cross-border data transfer and data flow? So how does the DPDPA handle data transfers outside India? And what steps should Indian companies take to stay compliant while also dealing with the foreign entities and making sure that they respect their policies as well?
Yeah, so I think, see, what has happened in case of GDPR, which was a privacy law for the European region, is that all the companies, Indian companies who were having clients in European region had to comply to GDPR. So in my mind, if there is Indian data which is going cross-border to any part of the world, those processors or those companies who are processing that information have to comply to DPDP. Yeah, so that it's a reverse obligation that they would have for compliance. But otherwise, I think there are other aspects in terms of data localization laws. Like RBI has certain expectations in terms of Indian banking data and what governance need to be put in place. So all of those will also come in play in terms of when you look at cross-border data going out and other things. So I think, but otherwise, any provision for the DPDP compliance that we are just going to talk about throughout this webinar will apply to the cross-border data transfer as well.
Right. So actually, we have a question that is relevant here from Mr. Dinesh Reddy. As per GDPR, largely, we are hosting SaaS applications in EU region. How DPDPA will impact Indian data residing in EU region and any considerations regarding data localization in India?
Yeah, so I think, we have had this, I think the good thing which has happened because of GDPR and its implementation is that there is a fairly good amount of understanding of how we look at cloud, how we look at SaaS in particular, and what are the obligations of the data owner, what are the obligations of data processor, and so on and so forth. I think the similar, while lot more details will come in future, but I think fundamentally the same obligations that we have had in terms of the data processor, the ISP, and the data owner will apply even when it comes to DPDP implementation and when it comes to how a SaaS application is implemented outside of India, right? So I think we should apply the same principles. We should not create something different. The number two aspect is that when you look at in terms of how the data is going, my sense is that as DPDP comes in and as India becomes more and more sensitive about it, I think there has to be a discovery first. The first is the discovery by all the body corporates to finding out where all their data actually is. And you'll be surprised the amount of revelations that will happen once you actually do the discovery. And once you have done the discovery, then you need to start deciding on what does it really mean in terms of having the data outside, and is it required by design, or with so many different hyperscalers now creating India data centers which are actually cheaper to host and manage, why would we really have data hosted outside of India when there is no need for it to be there by design? So I think that's the first parts that I guess should happen. After that, wherever there is a business justification to have data going out, that's when we need to start building all the safeguards that I just talked about in terms of obligations of data owners, the ISPs, and data processors.
Right, thank you, sir. So in accordance, building on that, as I rightfully mentioned that, why would we want to share data outside and for Indian customer data to be in India? RBI's data storage mandate just say that financial institutions like banks are supposed to store Indian customer data only within India. So how do you think the tech teams can design systems to comply with RBI's data localization techniques and with aligning with the DPDPA's data retention and erasure policies requirements, basically, ensuring secure, automated, and auditable data management?
Yeah, so I think there are multiple issues involved here, okay, and I'll try to kind of articulate them one by one. I think the first fundamental issue is that the data hoarding that currently happens, right? With the hope that you will keep on hoarding the data so that at some stage you will monetize it and use it for business benefits. And what happens over a period of time is that there is a lack of accountability and ownership of that data, and it just stays there. And God forbid if there is an incident and a breach and the data gets infiltrated and lost, that's when you actually start seeing an exposure to your organization and also to those customers who had that data over there in the first place. And we have seen many examples of these kind of breaches happening where the companies have asked the question as to why did we have this data in the first place, right? So there is therefore, when you look at the implementation of DPDP, there is a need for defining a clear policy and making each business teams accountable to define the requirement of what is the retention aspects of the data. That's the first part, right? Now, obviously the regulatory obligations supersede or override on that requirement, and so therefore you will have to maintain and retain that data. But when you look at an regulation like coming from RBI to retain your data, see, if you look at the percentage of structured data versus unstructured data, it's it used to be, 10 years back, 70-30. Now, I guess it is actually 80-20. 80% of the organization's data is actually unstructured. RBI doesn't expect you to maintain or retain unstructured data for 10 years, right? It only expects certain amount of that 20% of the structured data to be retained for a period of time, right? Now, so therefore, I think you need to, when you have that argument, you need to see in the context of what we're talking about. It's a very small part of the data which actually needs to be retained. Everything else can be purged or as per the policy. So that itself reduces a significant amount of risk from, your overall, portfolio that you have as an exposure. Now, in cybersecurity, we talk about attack surface, right? And we have to reduce the attack surface so that you are able to reduce the vulnerabilities and therefore the risk of cybersecurity attacks. Similarly, when you talk about privacy, you need to reduce the data surface so that you reduce the risk of a privacy breach. I think that's the notion that I would like to bring in here in terms of how we do it. And the last thing I would say is that it is extremely difficult. It sounds very simple, but extremely difficult, because imagine in a complex organization where there are so many business users, getting them on the table, making them accountable, making them understand the whole data flows, understanding what data is required, what is not required, and then defining the policy and then giving those requirements to IT, who are at best the custodians of your data, to go and execute the purge. So in my mind, the technical aspects of the solution and implementation is the easiest part. It's the policy definition and the behavioral aspects of getting the business accountable to ensure that the policy is defined and enforced is actually the most difficult part, that change we need to drive.
Right. So you are emphasizing basically on the role of securing localized data and role of encryption as per also the DPDPA. So exactly to build upon that, DPDPA Act enshrines data minimization principles. So urging entities to collect only essential data, as you rightfully mentioned. So how do you think the tech teams could actually implement this in a technical perspective? What sort of resources could they use, or workflows or systems that they could design? And also, what would be the pitfalls, common pitfalls that they would come across?
Yeah, so I think, as I said, fundamentally, technical aspects are much easier as compared to the procedural and the policy aspects. But having said that, there are various controls which are at your disposal when it comes to enforcement. And I would like to tell you a small story, right? Because when you look at its implementation, it's like the Data Privacy Office, which defines the policy requirements in terms of what are the things that are required from a privacy perspective. And there would be then for underlying cybersecurity controls, which you then actually align from those privacy controls and then start making sure that they become technical aspects of its implementation.
Okay, so we will, here is one interesting fact that I would like the Here's an interesting fact for the audience. Did you know that integrating privacy features into development lifecycle can save companies millions in compliance costs? The DPDPA strongly supports the privacy by design principle, but how can developers and tech architects incorporate this principle effectively in their projects? Let's break it down.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to the implementation of privacy by design, I think the important aspect is in terms of how we do the change management, right? So I think the first thing is making sure that we have a widespread awareness across your stakeholders. I think the first important stakeholder, as I told you about, is the business teams, but also the IT teams. So when you look at the evolution of cybersecurity, and cybersecurity as a domain and its implementation has been around for almost 3 decades. And we have said that we have to have a policy, and then we need to have controls, and then we need to have standards, and then we need to start enforcing. I think something similar needs to happen when it comes to privacy, because unless you define frameworks, unless we define standards, and unless we create like for example, in banking, we have something called PCI DSS, right? And then PCI DSS came out with something called PADSS, which is Application Security Standard. And that gets enforced across the world consistently for all the applications so that they comply to payment controls. Something similar needs to come out as an outcome when it comes to privacy, right? And then what you need to do is we define a privacy control standards for all your applications, and then you start giving it to your application owners, your IT team, so that they can start enforcing it. The only nuance I would add is that when it comes to privacy standard, there is a need for gap assessment, which can change by application to application. And so you do your gap analysis, and you need to create a framework for proper gap analysis so that it gets implemented and enforced in a consistent manner. Because it's very difficult to expect the IT teams to really understand on their own. So you have to make sure that it is enforced through a standard process, and there is a proper assessment and gap analysis done by privacy experts, so that all applications are built to the standard of privacy by design.
Okay, so for those of you who are joining us now, this webinar is Cracking the Code, Building DPDPA-Compliant Applications for India's Tech Ecosystem. We are going to be talking about the Digital Personal Data Protection Act of 2023, or the DPDPA, also known as. Here we will be diving deep into the technical landscape of this act, what exactly it would mean to the tech industry experts and the businesses that deal with technology. So let's continue with another question from our viewer. This is a question from Ms. Neha. How do I start with data discovery? We have so much data everywhere, like with my HR finance. How do I start with data discovery?
Yeah, so I think, so data discovery, see now the good news is that while we are talking about DPDP implementation in India, there are also multiple tools and solutions which are already available, which can be deployed in your organization so that you can not only look at your structured data, but your unstructured data. And so once you run that tool, you would be able to do complete discovery of that information. And just to simplify the way the tool works is that you will have different classifiers, and those classifiers have to be coded beforehand. So for example, when it comes to HR, you will have your HR classifiers where you will talk about your salary details or your banking account details or your employee code or your name and your date of birth and your sex and all of that, right? So you will have to, all of that is personal identifiable information. So you'll put that as a classifier, and then you do a data discovery to find out where all important aspects of your information are stored in the organization. And once you've done the discovery, then you look at in terms of what is the policy that you have defined for your HR when it comes to use of that information across your organization. And whenever you see non-compliance to the policy in unstructured or structured data, mostly you'll find it in unstructured data, you will then start taking actions for remediation. So that's the whole life cycle that you need to manage in terms of how you do not just do data discovery, classification, and then remediation in terms of against the policy that you have set for yourself.
Right. So you're widely known for bridging the gap between regulatory mandates and technical implementation. The DPDPA strongly supports privacy by design principle. So how do you think developers and tech architects incorporate this principle effectively in their projects or development lifecycle?
So, see, I think I would have to again fall back on the cybersecurity journey, right? And it's hard to enforce all the policies and controls consistently across your organization. We talk about famously shift left, right, where we talk about moving all the security controls from your second line to your first line, which is your IT teams, right? We need to start looking at even privacy with the same expectations, where you start shifting left. So once you define policies, you start shifting left and democratize it to a level where people understand what they need to do when it comes to implementing privacy by design. One thing I would like to say is that if you start today, I'm just appealing to all the organizations who are listening to us, that if you start today, It will take you, in a journey, it will take anything between 1 year, 2 years, 3 years for you to mature as an organization to a level where you want to be. So if you want to be a compliant organization, see when GDPR came in, they gave a couple of years for its implementation. Why did they give that? Is because they knew that it's a journey. It will take time for organizations to implement this change within the organization, and it's just not technology. And so similarly, when you have to start today for you to have a vision to get a reasonable level of compliance in next 2 years. And so all of these things that I just talked about needs to be instituted, and people need to be made accountable, like a DPO or a data privacy council, or defining the roles of different departments, which are the most critical departments that you want to start with, how do you start the enforcement, what kind of consequence management you want to put in place, so that if people are found a breach of that, then how do you respond to that, all of that. Also when you talk about globally, you will have to have works councils, engaging with them, working with them, all of that will also come in play. So yeah, I think all of these things are critical founding blocks for implementing and institutionalizing the changes for privacy by design.
Right. So can we take a step back and maybe explain what privacy by design principles are in a generic view for our audience, those of them who are not maybe familiar with the principle and the concept?
Yeah, so privacy by design, or anything by design, means that it is never an afterthought. It is embedded and included as a part of your design framework. So what does it mean? Let me give you an example. So if you have an application and you have a need to build an application, then privacy by design would mean that before that application is introduced into production, you will do a privacy gap assessment and compliance of that application against a defined standard which is already published for your organization, and you will make sure you'll take all efforts to comply before it is put in production. This is what privacy by design means. If you talk about from a DPDP construct, then you will make sure that every application will have a consent management. You will have data subject right management, understanding of what their subject rights are, and incorporating all of those aspects into your framework, right? So these are some examples of how you look at privacy by design. So making sure every different control that you want to have from a privacy point of view is integrated and embedded into your processes and technology and policies by default.
Right, that was very crisp and concise, sir. Thank you. So let's touch upon real life case studies or such examples that would actually help our users, viewers understand the application of this. So for example, say, let's take up a sensitive topic, which is children's data. With edtech platforms booming in India, the DPDPA places strict controls on how children's data is handled. So how does the DPDPA guide child data protection, and how companies can build systems with features like parental control and verification to comply with these rules?
Yeah, so I think DPDP is very clear that any child which is of the age below 18 years have to have a verifiable consent taken from the guardian, right? So when you look at your deployment of your consent management, you need to make sure that this aspect is covered in its implementation, right? So that's number one. Number two, when you talk about advertising and reaching out to people for soliciting actions related to purchase of any product or service, it has to be done in a reasonable manner, especially when it comes to children, which should not cause any harm to their mind or their overall behaviors. So all of that also is very clearly specified. So I think it's good. It's good that we are actually considering right now at the first implementation itself, and so that we are able to sort of control how the personal data and also behaviors and reaching out of these advertisement agencies into the younger people is actually controlled and managed. And so therefore that needs to be enforced in all the controls that we're talking about in implementation.
Right. So another scenario is where many Indian e-commerce companies pseudonymize user data to protect privacy while also conducting their in-house analytics for their performance or marketing or operations. So how do you think the pseudonymization meets the DPDP Act's data protection requirements, and what are the best practices that they could incorporate in implementing this?
Yeah, so we talked about anonymization, which is basically removing the personal identifiable data. When you talk about pseudonymization, it is about changing the identifier to some other dummy number, which can be eventually traced back to, so you can reverse it to go back to the original identifier. Now, I can give you one good use case which is used in banking, where when we do certain critical credit card transactions on a switch and other things, tokenization is a good technique which can achieve anonymization and pseudonymization as well, where you use the tokens instead of the actual account number to verify and communicate across two different systems, and the original number is never exposed. So you protect, so you can actually reverse and reach back to your original number through the token, but because that whole process is secured, what you are exposing is just a token which can never be used by any other system to compromise the privacy, but at the same time, when it comes back, you can again go back in your systems to securely reach back to the identifier and manage your processes. So this is really how the nuanced differences are between anonymization and tokenization.
Yeah, actually, so building on that, there's a question relative from Mr. Hemant Kumar Shukla. Whether anonymization or pseudonymization to be in privacy by design and privacy by default, or it may be designed at any point of time later after data is collected to process?
I think, so this is idealistic thinking, right? If you do it by design, obviously the cost of implementation is far lesser than to do it afterwards as an afterthought, because by that time you have implemented the system and then you start putting these controls in place. It's like trying to refuel an aircraft while it is in the air. So you'll always have challenges and more cost associated if you want to do it later. But the reality of our business is that you will always have, for a currently running business, you will always have legacy applications, and you have no choice but to implement it while the applications are already live. But if it's a greenfield project, I would say that I would always advise to implement all these controls beforehand before you actually go live into production.
Right. So I hope that answers your question, Mr. Hemant Kumar Shukla ji. Let's take another question from Mr. Hacker's Exploit. How will the DPDPA impact organizations' existing data management practices, and what strategies should they adopt to ensure compliance while maintaining operational efficiency?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and a simple answer is that what we have to do is to look at how the world has reacted to any regulation, privacy regulation that has happened in different parts. And what you have seen is that whenever a privacy law gets enforced, you have seen not only the overall improvement of how privacy is managed within the organization, but also there is multiple leaps of the maturity of cybersecurity that happens in that given country or those organizations in those jurisdictions. And that is because, like I said, the foundational controls like encryption, tokenization, digital rights management, classification, data loss prevention, all these controls are cybersecurity controls meeting the privacy obligations. And the moment we start looking at a privacy law coming in, you need to start in the context of looking at it holistically in terms of what it really means to the overall ecosystem and what happens to the maturity. And so my anticipation is that there will be a 10 to 15% rise in the awareness and its adoption of privacy and cybersecurity in India as well when the DPDP law comes into play. And it's a great thing because, of course, there are business drivers to start implementing cybersecurity controls in a given organization. But when it comes to regulatory aspects and become systemic risk aspects and privacy aspects, I think it also gives that much impetus towards, improving the overall hygiene and control so that, overall the digital ecosystem is moving in the right direction and there is a trustworthy trustworthiness towards how the communication happens between two different individuals or systems or devices. So I think that trust can build in once we start seeing that multiple levels of maturity leap which happens because of such regulations.
Right. So can we take a more technical dive into this for our techie viewers? What frameworks or what sort of resources could the developers implement in compliance checks during the CI/CD, which is continuous integration and continuous deployment pipelines? So could you touch upon that in a technical aspect?
Yeah, so I think, see, when you look at privacy or data breaches, right, we have seen many examples right now where there is evidence of contamination of CI/CD pipeline where a major cybersecurity breach has happened, right? SolarWinds is a very good public example of a contamination of a CI/CD pipeline where the supply chain got compromised, and as a result, multiple organizations which were actually using that software were impacted. So I think, purely from that point of view, it becomes very important for all software development organization to, assure their customers that they have a robust process in managing the whole CI/CD pipeline, so that there is a trust which is built in terms of how the supply chain works. So that's the minimum. But having said that, I would go beyond just the CI/CD pipeline. When you look at in terms of the overall application lifecycle development, I will fall back to my earlier comment of, can we have a PADSS equivalent for privacy where there is a global standard in terms of how we develop applications which are having all aspects of consent management, cookie consent management, and various other things embedded by design when these applications are developed. And also doing privacy gap assessment, because applications can be standardized to a certain extent, but because they have their own business flow, some of them are very customized. And there we need to do some custom assessments before they get implemented. So my response to this is that the developer teams basically are conditioned to work on the specs, okay? So I would say that demand specs for, as you're demanding specs for security and functionality, you should also now demand specs for privacy before you actually start building your systems. Now I know it's a big ask because but I think we need to go and become more proactive so that you are able to push back on businesses and your people so that it doesn't become an afterthought where, like I said, the cost of doing and implementing privacy afterwards is far expensive than doing it at design.
Right, so you talk about the domino effect, basically, that one pitfall leads to another and then it affects the entire ecosystem or the entire chain of ecosystem. So how do you think that the techs should already have some standard operating procedures or set guidelines, or there should be any new compliance strategies that should be followed, and maybe it should be categorized domain-wise, that industry sector-wise, or how would you say that the India developers could navigate through this?
So I think there are two aspects to this. One is in terms of what we need to do as an industry, and the other thing is what an individual organization need to do for themselves, right? The industry, to answer your earlier question, that industry has come out with certain standards, right, in terms of for security, which is NIST and ISO 27001. But now we also have a privacy standard from ISO, which can be deployed and implemented. So I think we have to now start looking at adopting these standards into your organization. So the industry has to evolve and keep on adding more and more granularity and depth in the standards so that they can be broader. And in my view, it's my personal view that we don't need to go by industries. We can create one standard across the industry, which can be generic in nature, but still enough depth for it to be implemented across. And you can then customize that based on applicability for your industry or for your business model. So that is one thing which needs to happen. But the more important aspect is how do you define, therefore, that framework within your organization. Now, typically, it's a responsibility of the data privacy officer and the chief information security officer who needs to come together to define those standards because actually the implementation will still be done by IT. It's the same common team which will do all the implementation. So you need to make sure that the framework is robust, it is defined, and so then you define the enforcement and its implementation. So I think both aspects are equally important.
Right, that makes totally sense. But how would you say, with the use of AI or automation in blockchain technology and cybersecurity as well, how could, the tech architects who are going to be doing this, designing this, what sort of automation techniques can they use? Because there, again, the problem comes of, collecting more data than necessary or processing it in a certain way, but that could not probably be ethical. So how would you say that, what sort of challenges they would face in building such platforms, and how would they adhere to consent management as well as per the DPDPA?
Yeah, so I think it's a very important question in terms of what are the implications to your technology architecture or your enterprise architecture when you talk about implementing privacy controls. I'll give you a good example, right? So when we are looking at a control like encryption, there are various solutions available, in terms of how you would want to deploy the encryption. Do you want to do it at a database level? Do you want to do it at the disk level? And what do you do for data at rest? What do you do for data in motion? And there are various solutions available. Now, what would work for your enterprise architecture has to be tested, and then you need to start defining what is the right technology available for you to implement that, and then you start doing the implementation. So this is very important control, because what happens is that the moment you start doing it, there is additional overhead in terms of how much latency it introduces in the processing of that information. And so you need to make sure that proper compute and proper storage is planned in terms of capacity to be able to manage that control, at the same time manage the availability and processing speed and response time to the end users, right? So this is just one example. Like that, you will have to have multiple other controls that you need to plan properly. When you talk about a control like anonymization, like, when you talk about in banking, in call centers, all the confidential data is masked, right? And that is by design, because banks have been doing it for many years, right? Before even privacy, there is a Banking Confidentiality Act, which they have to comply to right from the time the banks were actually created. And that continues, and therefore it's a need to know, need to do kind of a basis principle which is adopted. And every application has that masking or tokenization which is implemented, so that only critical information is provided and confidential information is masked. So, but a lot goes into defining that policy and then enforcing that technically. And every architect needs to then define that and make sure that at a field level that masking happens. So that's another example, right? So, but when it comes to consent management, I think because it is becoming like a more of an infrastructure, consent management is one thing where you don't embed that as a code within each application, but you create a consent management infrastructure and you integrate your applications with that consent management infrastructure. So that way, you are able to manage it as more of an API-driven framework. So that's another consideration that you would have in terms of how you built it. And now there are various solutions available in the market where you can just pick it up and then integrate that with your applications. So that's really how the technology is evolving. But I think it's very critical that you have a blueprint around that, because if you don't, then you will be doing it more reactively. And doing it reactively will create a lot of non-compliance and also incur more costs.
So do you think that every organization head should maybe have internal policies to lay down for the tech teams or the architects, system architects, to actually come up with certain framework or a standard operating procedure? So do you think they should evolve in this practice for internal policy and to comply with DPDPA?
Absolutely. I think it is a very complex topic and it needs to be done at a very strategic level. And when you talk about strategic level, we are really talking about enterprise architecture, right? And getting the enterprise architecture to first define that whole framework and then align it with that. And there would be challenges because you'll have a lot of legacy applications, you will have a lot of technology debt which is integrated. In fact, the technology debt will become much more apparent when you talk at implementing the new privacy controls on that technology debt. So I think that needs to be, because it is so difficult, it needs to be taken head on, because it will take a lot more time to actually implement these controls. And so unless there is a leadership sponsorship, leadership investment, and leadership support in making this happen, looking at it to be driven operationally or tactically is not going to really solve the problem. So my request to all the leaders who are watching this, all the CEOs who are watching this, is that this is a very important topic which requires your attention to give the necessary leadership and sponsorship for you to actually have any chance of implementing privacy by design in your organization.
Right, exactly. So what about the data that is already with them? So retroactive, managing the consent of retroactive data, and which is collected before the DPDPA Act's enforcement. So how do you think the tech team can now, trace their steps back and design for privacy and future ahead?
Yeah, so I think tech teams, the implementation part I'll talk about in a bit, but there has to be an underlying assumption that the policy and what needs to be implemented is defined by the business and the DPO office. That is a fundamental thing. Tech team on their own cannot do anything when it comes to that. So once that is defined, let's say for example, they say that this kind of information available in an unstructured form is not acceptable in your organization. Then they can define that information as a classifier. The tech team can define that as a classifier in their data discovery and classification tool, and then do a discovery to give a view to business in terms of how many non-compliances are there. After that, there has to be a proper workflow where those non-compliances are handed over to the right owners within the business teams for them to take decisions on whether that data has to be deleted or not. Again, that decision cannot be taken by the tech team. So that whole flow has to happen. This is just one example of how the policy, framework, and technology integration happens together, right? Like that, everything else. So you would, typically whenever you do announcement of an enforcement of a law as big and as complex and robust as data privacy, you allow certain amount of time for a body corporate to actually plan and ensure compliance. So you would give anything between 1 year, 18 months, or 2 years, depending on the complexity and the requirements of the law. So what will happen is, once the law comes in, the business and the privacy team will define the policy. They will give that policy to the tech team. Tech team will help in doing gap assessment, and based on the gap assessment, there will be a work program. Work program will need investments and money for implementation. Once the money is secured, then they will run 5 or 6 large strategic IT projects for its implementation. And by the end of that implementation, you will have a reasonable compliance against the law. So that all of that will unfold for you to be able to have that compliance in place.
So that was a very beautiful step-by-step breakdown of how the leadership could actually implement this. Let's take another question from Ms. Chaitraya Sindikar. She asks, when assessments are done or DPIAs are done, do you think we need a tool or can we do it on Excel?
I think Excel can work if you're doing few assessments. You're a small organization, but very soon they will start failing the moment you go for large organizations which has got 25,000, 30,000, 50,000, 100,000, 200,000 users. It just will not scale. For there, you will need a tool which would do a survey-based assessment, impact assessment, where there is a traceability, auditability, and also control in terms of managing the non-compliances, and you have full record for you to be able to look at what assessments were done, at what stage, what was your compliance, and how you're improving against that. I would go one step ahead to have a tool which will not only help you to do assessment, but also check real-time compliance against that assessment wherever possible, so that you get real-time feed on how much progress you're making. So if you imagine a world where eventually you'll have privacy KPIs or privacy KRIs key performance indicators and key risk indicators, which will sense data and information coming from all the controls and give you a one-place view to tell you exactly how you're performing against the defined standards. So automation, I think, is very critical, and tooling and solutioning is very critical for you to really have a good control and be able to scale in any given organization.
Right. So when you talk about, say, a database management system of KPIs or KRIs, again, the challenge of, for the data architects would be how to align with DPDPA's data minimization principles, right? And what exactly, when you talk about automation, so what strategies do you think the IT teams should adopt to automate data retention and erasure policies, but in the purview of DPDPA?
I think again, I would say that the technology part is the easy part. Once you define the purging requirement on the database or an application, it's a question of just writing the coding, the scripts or coding in your application so that the necessary purge happens. In my past experience, I've found that the moment the requirements were specified to the tech team, its implementation is not that challenging. But making sure that the definition is there is the most important aspect that I would want to again harp on. But there are various strategies that you could adopt, right? In fact, you can go to the extent of building and embedding that as a parametric feature in future for applications, right? Where at every record level, you are able to define based on certain policies what is the retention criteria. So if you look at any major application, will have various parameter settings, right? For example, in a core banking application, you will have interest rate settings, you will have how they need to be managed, all of that. I think they need to start also looking at archival aspects embedded, so that once the policy decisions are made, you don't even need to have tech team to actually do it. It's the application which actually ensures that the purging happens based on the defined frequency.
Right. So when you talk about data security measures, under API communication, under the DPDPA standards, how can developers ensure secure API communications, and how can they also prevent vulnerabilities during an API injection or insecure token exchanges? As you've already touched upon the token exchange tokenization process and methodology, but there is always a challenge of the security feature. So what would you say would be the best practice?
Yeah, I think API security is a very estimated topic when it comes to cybersecurity and privacy, right? Today, if you look at the microservices and the application architectures, you will be surprised the amount of API calls which are made from application to application and from one system to another system, one service provider to another service provider. That dependency is only growing, and so you need to start with first really doing a discovery of all the API calls which are there within your organization, right? Organization technology landscape. Once you have done the discovery, we need to start looking at which APIs are managed well, as in, you are able to ensure that there is no man in the middle, there is no possibility of a tampering. Server-side validation was one example in good old days where we had so many different frauds happening in bank because there was not proper validation which was happening between the client and the server within an application. In the browser itself, there was so many tampering and no validation checks available on the application side. Similarly, when you now talk about API architecture, we should look at in terms of what are the possible manipulations that can happen when these API conversations are happening. And then start looking at, how do you start building the countermeasures or improving the security and the robustness of those APIs so that it does not lead to any breach or anything related to integrity, confidentiality, and availability of your information. So it is underestimated topic right now. I think we need to give more effort to that, given the fact that the developers are using APIs for every modern application now. And somebody needs to look at it holistically in terms of how do you govern, how do you secure, and how do you control the whole API infrastructure.
So building on that, do you think predictive analytics could help in identifying these potential breaches or any risks that are there to assess before? What would you say in that regard?
So basically, if you look at how the overall frameworks and monitoring systems have evolved, they have always, one aspect of the strategy has been to look at analytics in a manner which will give you some sense of what's happening, right? And I think the same thing needs to happen when it comes to these aspects, whether it's API, whether it is OLTP transactions, or whether it is B2B, B2C, and all the way in which the computer interactions are happening. What are those interactions telling us? So one of the things to look at it is that what kind of telemetry I am getting. Telemetry has got three context or three aspects. Okay, one aspect is in terms of usability and consumption, right? Second aspect is security and incidents and identifying outliers. Third aspect is in terms of supportability. So based on issues, do I have enough telemetry data to support the availability of that system? All these three aspects need to be thought through at the time of design, so that you are able to collect data and telemetry, so that you are able to achieve all these three objectives. One objective, of course, you are alluding to is in terms of how can analytics and the data can help you to secure your application, both from a privacy point of view as well as security point of view. And that is the important cog. Reality is it's something which the developer community is just opening up to. So one of the things that we have enforced as a fundamental principle when you talk about coding is to have the philosophy of telemetry very deeply embedded in all the applications that we develop, all the products that we develop. So that has to be a foundation building block when anybody develops an application, so that all these three concepts are covered. And when you have eyes, or when you define, you can measure. If you measure, you can improve. So those fundamental things are very critical.
Right. So that was very elucidative, sir. Thank you. Coming to the point of these businesses being data fiduciaries, basically. So how do you think they would be able to handle the rights of the data principals, which is the customers or the users, in terms of giving them, the users, complete control over their own data? We spoke about consent management and all, but when the user goes into a website or an application, there is the first thing of cookies, rejecting cookies or accepting cookies. So how do you think, without hindering their backend or any performance efficiency, how do you think the IT teams can design systems to allow data principals to exercise their rights? That is, data access, correction or erasure. How do you think this would be achieved in a technical manner?
Yeah, so see, like I said, consent management is evolving as a framework and a horizontal infrastructure which will integrate with your application layer. So think of it as like, making that foundational block ready. So once you have the foundational block ready, then you start, onboarding each of your applications into that consent management block. So that is the one way to look at how to implement it. But if you want to go, the next phase of that is in terms of how you marry your consent management infrastructure with actually what's happening in your application processing or business processing. Because at the end of the day, taking a consent and not testing that consent against what is the actual practice is of no use. So you need to then, therefore, somehow integrate that infrastructure with the real life execution of how data is processing by application to identify non-compliances, which need to be then flagged off to the respective stakeholders for its remediation, right? So it could be a bad business practice where you are taking a consent from the customer that you're not allowed to transfer that data on an email or outside your organization, and it's only to be used for certain processes. And then you start seeing that information being used for a unauthorized process. It needs to be flagged off. So that marrying of these two aspects is very critical for you to then do enforcement. So that is again a technical aspect. It has to be automated, and so your discovery and classification and classifier has to go in tandem with your consent management.
Right. So let's take a question building on that. Mr. Daksh Kurana is asking how consent management integration will happen with current applications and platforms. Is it very difficult to achieve?
So, something similar to what I just mentioned before this question was asked. I think you will have to look at it as a horizontal infrastructure which need to be implemented. I think compared to the other privacy controls, in my mind, consent management, the first phase of consent management is an easier aspect of integrating and making sure that the user aspect, user is giving a consent and you're recording it, I think is the easier part into and for an application. But the second part of marrying that to classifiers and discovery and identifying non-compliance is a much difficult problem to achieve, but it needs to be done.
So again, on similar lines, Ms. Meenal Bhatia asks, for consent management, will there be need of console to manage it?
There is, I can imagine that there is going to be an admin console. I can visualize a privacy operations team, which would be defined in a given organization. The privacy operations team ideally should be democratized, which means that we need to have them embedded into each of the business units. So you look at cybersecurity world where we have evolved a role called BISO, right? Business Information Security Officer. So similarly, we need to have a business privacy information security officer, which is embedded in each business, and that person will have a console to look at exactly how information and consent and various other controls of privacy are happening within that particular department. If you don't have it, it is going to be very difficult to enforce its implementation. So I see that particular administrator having a console of how the different aspects are working, identifying non-compliances, keeping a track record, and the topic I talked about KPIs and KRIs, all of those should be there for him to look at, and then he enforces and make each department owners accountable to make sure that those are getting implemented. I don't see that as an IT function. I don't see that as a DPO function centrally managed. It needs to be democratized and given to each individual, and therefore that console will be important.
Right. So let's maybe reshift our perspective as to coming back to the most basic question of, do you think the DPDPA would make a techie's life more difficult and more, say, protective, or they have to be a little walk on the eggshells of sorts, or do you think that would be actually easy and would pave the path for them to navigate better and have standard operating procedures in place?
So I would try to change that question slightly differently. Okay, so look at it, right? DPDPA is a need of the hour. Okay, we are having so much of adoption of digital. We can't imagine our lives without a computer screen or a mobile screen where data is exchanged. That if you want to have trustworthiness of that data, if you need to be able to trust my information to any third party, for that third party to give me an assurance that it is processing that data for the only intended purpose that I want them to, and I want to have full control of that. For future, that notion of having that control is very, very critical, right? And so that is fundamental and given. Now, it is a big change, especially in a country like India, where it's a cultural change, right? Where we have to become more prudent and more aware of what the implications of personal data are to the individuals and citizens. Because pardon me for saying this, but there are times when we take it for granted, right? And data is being misused or used for various purpose for which the end user is not actually intended it for, right? But there is a casualness towards this. So therefore, I think this act is very important to bring some seriousness and cultural change and behavioral change when it comes to digital use of data, right? Which is very different from a social use of data. So I think that part we need to understand. So that is given, and that's very important. Now, so because of that change, it is obviously going to fundamentally change and put an ask from IT to build some additional controls and work. But so long as IT is given necessary sponsorship and necessary bandwidth to include that into their day-to-day work, it will work, because why would IT have a problem with that? But problem happens when you expect them to do all of that without any bandwidth and without any sponsorship. That's where it is seen as a burden. And whatever is not immediately visible will get dropped. And privacy or security are those aspects where they are only visible when there is a breach happens. Otherwise, you would be blissfully unaware of that. So hence there is a need for the leadership to make sure there is a proper allocation of bandwidth and funds, so that IT does not see it as a burden, but see it as an additional challenge to go ahead and actually implement it.
Right, so here's a very interesting and relevant question from Mr. Artist Ganesh Karangare. He asks, how do I teach my developers about privacy by design? I think it is a huge task for us. What are your views?
Yeah, so same thing that we have learned how to do security by design is how we need to implement privacy by design, right? So first of all, if you want to train people of privacy by design, you need to have a framework of standards which can be taught, right? So we need to make sure, first of all, that is defined as a proper curriculum, which means that it has to be drawn from the policy and standards that you already defined, which means you are assuming that is already in place. So once that is in place, you define that curriculum and then have proper training and awareness session and technical session so that they understand what it means for its implementation. Quite often, I think one of the things which we have realized over a period of time is that generally, especially if there is no funding or bandwidth available, IT tends to push back saying that cybersecurity or privacy is a very difficult topic to manage, and so it should be done by somebody else. And they don't realize that actually it's the monkey which is there on their back. Eventually it will come to bite them, so the sooner they realize they need to do it, the better. So that syndrome should not be repeated in privacy. Given that we have learned that from cyber, we have to make sure that we don't allow that to happen, and we establish that full accountability within IT, that privacy by design is actual implementation is still your responsibility. You understand technology better than anybody else. A privacy guy is at best a legal person who understands laws and rules and definitions of what consent management and data subject right management and all of those are. But when it comes to its implementation across different technology stack, it's the IT person who's aware. So that person needs to translate those requirements into the technical controls, and they need to be made accountable and empowered with necessary skills and knowledge so that they are able to execute that.
I think it's more like a trial and error and find what is the best practice for their own particular business or say particular industry. And I think they would go around learning as and when they
The only change I would say is that because we have done some trial and error when it comes to cyber, we can learn from that and get it more by design and more by default when it comes to privacy. We don't need to repeat the same mistakes that we have already learned, and try and make it more systematic so that the trial and error becomes much lesser as compared to what has happened in past.
Right. So errors would be minimized and optimization would be achieved better. So here's another question from Mr. Varun. He asks, if a data breach happens, what are the measures already deployed in the organization that may save an organization from penalty?
Okay, so see, first is that it is very important that you understand your obligations to communicate with regulatory authorities on what has happened to your organization. At the same time, you also should not do it in haste. So you have to make sure there is a proper understanding of what has happened. You don't want to over communicate, you don't want to less communicate, and you also need to do it in a timely manner. And that's why, like I said, the tabletop exercise and the training part is very important, so that you execute a playbook when it happens. So you need to make sure that you execute your playbook to comply to the minimum requirement of regulatory disclosures are maintained. After that, it's all about then looking at what has happened. So in case you've had a major breach, then I don't think you can avoid penalties just because you have done a timely notification. You have to take ownership of that breach, and whatever it takes to recover from that, you will have to do. Typically, any large organizations will have a cyber insurance, so you will have necessary cover towards addressing the cost of recovery, the cost of legal, the cost of customer business loss, and all of those are covered, and so you will be eventually able to get that money back. But yeah, you need to make sure that you not only comply but also you do the right things when it comes to response, And cyber resiliency and privacy resiliency is a very important aspect of today's modern businesses. You need to have enough attention put in place. It's a part of your disaster recovery planning in future.
So be ethical, be responsible. And with India being a hub of startups, do you think the cyber insurance that you were talking about should also be incorporated at a starting level, not just at the very high level of organizations or larger companies or organizations? So what would you say for the startups? How do you think they should follow on these guidelines?
I think every business, whether it is startup, medium, and at a different stages of its journey, has to really define the cyber and the regulatory risks from privacy, right? And based on that, you can then decide on what is the risk exposure, and it is a well-defined template now, okay? So it's not rocket science anymore. Once you have kind of gone through that template, you will exactly know what is the exposure that we have, and accordingly, what is it that you need to invest so that you are having enough amount of cover for those breaches.
Right, so another question by Open Talks. They ask, what are the must-have solutions to achieve DPDP compliance? So as you already touch upon those steps for the senior leadership, what do you think it would also apply to individuals or, again, startups, as we are emerging in startups as well?
I think the point for startups is about, if you are generally a startup would have an app or a system or a platform that they are introducing. So I think they have to just ensure that the privacy by design principles that you would want to implement in your platform or application are there by design, and you give enough thought so that when practitioners start adopting or when citizens start using it, there is enough amount of compliance to that, because in future, there would be a regulatory expectation that you have to comply to various aspects of your platform. So the sooner you do it, the better. A lot of times, startups are not only just building apps and solutions, but they're also doing, it's like a SaaS. So you're also an ISP. And so you have obligations, in terms of what you need to do to control that data. And so therefore, apart from that, you also need to make sure you have your own DPO, your own processes, so that you're able to manage that whole life cycle. And all the things that we talked about today are implemented for that application.
So building on that, sir, what do you think, the steps that IT teams could take to mitigate risks of bias and re-identification? So there is data that can get, resurfaced, or it could be a copy of it, or forgery or such. What do you think the tech teams how do you think they should navigate around this?
I think the easy way to navigate that is to have your discovery and classification control happening on an ongoing basis. A lot of organizations, in order to reduce costs, do it as a one-time activity, right? So that it is not something which goes on an ongoing basis. I think that may have a short-term measure, but if you want to ensure that it is implemented on an ongoing basis, you need to do that incremental scans on an ongoing basis, so that you start discovering non-compliances real time and you are able to efficiently do it. I do understand that if you are starting your journey, you may do it in a phased manner, but eventually you want to go there.
Right, so do you think that there should be a regular code of reviews or security audits, and there should be how much timely, and what sort of measures they should take into making sure that that is complied into their development cycle?
See, I think we have that first line, second line, and third line controls. Right? First line is IT and IS team. Second line is the privacy and the cyber team, and third line is the audit team. Each one will have to do their role. The first line typically is a concurrent thing, real-time thing, right? Which will constantly implement controls in an automated manner in real time. The second line will actually be little less frequent, because it is doing more catching the things which are not happening in a proper manner. So it is testing the controls and testing the design rather than its execution. So test of execution is with the first line, and so it is it is real time. Test of design is less frequent, but it still needs to happen on an ongoing basis through the second line, through DPO office. The third line is the audit team, which will look at both TOD and TOE, and they will do it in much more lesser frequency. So all the three will have to work in tandem. But what is happening is, with a lot of automation, all these three areas are doing more and more automation. So as they do more and more automation, the frequency is will keep on reducing, and you'll have more concurrency coming into the way we review and the way we audit.
So with automation, there also comes a risk of error or judgment or even human understanding error. So how do you think they could overcome that, or maybe not overlook even the minute mistake or error in the audit?
I would actually argue the other way around. Actually, if you leave it to humans, there'll be more errors. Automations will actually ensure that there are no human errors and biases, right? So the question is, how do you ensure that you reduce the false positives, and you will only automate when there is a high level of comfort in that automating that process. So that's really what you want to do to ensure that you're implementing automation. I think automation is the way to go. We truly believe that simplification is very critical for any process to work consistently with efficiency and efficacy. So you have to automate, and your endeavor always should be towards that. But I think there is another aspect of the biases when it comes to privacy, and I think those aspects are also important, especially when you talk about AI and other aspects. I think you need to be more careful in terms of how these biases does not influence your final outcome and decision-making system. And so care needs to be taken in terms of how you design them properly and how you test them so that they are actually operating the way you want it to, what is your desire for it to operate.
Exactly. So how will these emerging techs, like how you mentioned AI, blockchain, and IoT, how would they affect the compliance under DPDPA?
I think it only makes the topic much more complicated because you not only have to worry about all the things that we talked about, but you now also need to worry about programs which will actually learn on the fly based on the data which is given to them, and they can learn the right way, they can learn the wrong way. And so you have to make sure that you navigate them in the right direction. But there are many examples where pockets of areas where you can apply AI to a very effective way to manage and solve some very complex problems when it comes to privacy and cyber. And so I think it's a very interesting and very fascinating topic where a lot more research and lot more practitioner knowledge will evolve as we start looking at it, when we start managing it. Of course, when you talk about IoT, I think machines are less worried about PII as compared to humans. So it's okay, so long as we're not collecting data of what the humans are doing behind the machines. I think IoT is not that big a topic right now. But in future, of course, that can also be a moment we start looking at how humans are using that IoT and how that telemetry can be misused against those individuals. And there, I think privacy controls will apply.
So, but from your experience, could you break it down and give a real case scenario if you have ever come across something similar? On the same thing that you've spoken about, IoTs and blockchain and AI, and the scenario that they might have to face in the future. So is there any relevant example that people could understand?
I think one example on AI is, for example, any credible AI to be implemented, it requires a lot of data, okay? And it is exactly opposite to the principles of privacy, where you're saying reduce data, right? So how do you balance between the accountability, who takes the call? Because somebody who wants to build a data model will ask for that data and may also go on the other side of holding that data, and the privacy guy will say this data is not acceptable, right? So sometimes I've seen extreme examples where the positions are so extreme that there is no middle ground, and that is a fundamental challenge, right? And at times I see that it's very difficult to intervene and get people to come to the middle ground. But we have to find the middle ground, and that's a challenge. And that will come in every aspect of enforcement of privacy. So it's a very fascinating topic, and it's less technical and more policy driven, where people don't agree on what is the right policy that needs to be implemented, because they are tasked to do certain aspects for their own requirements.
Right. So what do you think would be the additional compliance checks that the developers should include before approving or handling any sort of data transfer, whether it's Indian, domestic or international?
I think see, there are two elements to this, okay? One is in terms of how you have coded the policy requirements into your systems. And then after that, at a transactional level, the enforcement is actually done by the operations team. So when it comes to, for example, a DLP control, right, which has got privacy implications also, because inadvertently, if you're sharing a employee confidential file to a particular region, where it is a big no, it's a breach of privacy for that particular region, and it can be identified through a DLP control, and that gets enforced through HR. So it's the HR team which needs to be cognizant of that, and either implement a preventive control, which is difficult, but if it's a detective control, then what are the remediation steps that needs to be done so that it gets implemented? So enforcement, if you ask me, is a responsibility not just for IT, but the back-end operational teams within each business unit for the processes who help you to enforce privacy controls and do the whole lifecycle management of those incidents identified.
So let's take another question from Ms. Vidya Karangade. She asks, in the diverse data landscape to achieve DPDPA compliance, is it important to have data discovery and classification done as it is important? So you already touched upon this, but if you could build on something more, that would...
Yeah, so I think if I do just build on, look at it like this, right? So if you are today starting for DPDP compliance, then the first thing that you need to do is define the classifiers and policies. Then you apply that and do a discovery of your structured and unstructured data, identify non-compliances, then make each individual business owners accountable for what is an expected action that they need to take. So suppose an HR department or finance department you start with, and if they have, say, thousands of non-compliances, give them a target that within the next 6 months, reduce that 1,000 to 500, and then that 500 to 250. Eventually it comes down to 150, and then manage on the real time. So that is going to be the journey. So you have that whole life cycle. Then you have consent management, which you implement. You do application cookie consent management, and then you do gap assessment and all of that. So all of this can be done through tooling. Build all of this into your framework. So you have governance, you have discovery, and then you have enforcement. So these three broad legs of implementation will help you to go about doing that whole implementation for DPDPA compliance.
That's very well put, sir, actually. So Mr. Aditya Digarse asks, for retention schedules to be implemented, do you think we need technology support for this, for data retention schedule implementation?
I think technology support is definitely required, but how they, like I said, there is enough solutions available with tech team to actually get this implemented now. The key thing is for you to tell them what they need to do. So IT will do it, but you need to tell them what they need to do so that they will get that implemented for you.
Right. So what role do you think data protection officers play in this, guiding the developers in compliance? And since you've already touched upon this, so could you maybe, summarize it on how the IT teams can handle and collaborate teams effectively within them? Because this is not one person or one team process, and there's a continuous flow of data from one team to another. So how do you think a structure can be developed here without the loss of data or without any risks?
Yeah, so I think when you look at, this is a very important question, right? And I think everybody should be very attentive when I'm talking about these topics per se. First is that the DPO role has two facets, okay? First facet is what they do with businesses in terms of enforcing the privacy requirement on processes and applications and systems, okay? Another aspect is how they then translate those into technical controls, which they drive its implementation through the CISO office into the IT. You don't want to reinvent the wheel because, like I said, all the fundamental privacy technical controls fall into the domain of cybersecurity. So it is best done by the CISO office, which is already having the necessary arsenal to work with IT to get it implemented. So the DPO doesn't need to be accountable for its implementation. Their accountability only lies in explaining what controls they want CISO to implement with IT. So these are the two aspects. And of course, they do get involved in breach response and remediation and all the legal aspects of customer communication, regulatory communication, and so forth, and incident response management from a privacy point of view. Technical point will be with IT and with cyber team. So that's really how I feel the roles are emerging. And within that, I think collaboration and motivating each player to play that role is very important, and empowering them with funds, sponsorship and bandwidth is also equally important, because they cannot just do it out of thin air. They will have to be given necessary mandates, and it sometimes can be a thankless job. So you need to motivate them to keep on doing it regularly and incentivize them so that they are motivated to do it, to the thankless job, and still get the enforcement done. So all of this is, I think, equally important for all these teams, the DPO team, the CISO team, and the IT team, to work in a very collaborative manner and a seamless manner so that this difficult topic is implemented.
Absolutely. So before we wrap up, here's a question of sorts for the viewers to ponder on. What do you think will be the biggest challenge for developers in implementing DPDPA compliance? Feel free to share your thoughts in our comment box. So we've covered a lot today, from data anonymization, pseudonymization, to data breach, and even child protection data protection. It is clear that DPDP is just not a compliance checklist, but it's an opportunity for the Indian tech industry to lead the way in a secure and ethical data practices. So do you have any final thoughts to wrap this up?
No, I think it's great that we have covered so many different topics in a very short span of time. I hope it was useful for the audience. But thank you so much for asking these questions, and I hope this information was useful. But I would say that it's a great opportunity for us as stakeholders or custodians of data from our stakeholders, and it's opportunity and also responsibility. The legal framework is only helping us to enforce that with the expectation that what we need to do for addressing the systemic risk to the digitization. So we have to come together. We need to talk about it. We need to look at what are the solutions available in front of us and start. I think the journey has to start. You cannot sit on the fence and wait for something else to happen. That will be a very reactive approach. I think we need to become more proactive. We need to make sure that all the lessons learned from our past experience of implementing cybersecurity controls are applied into privacy by design, so that we spread that awareness across stakeholders, and make sure that India leapfrogs into the privacy regime in a manner where it not only gives a good, trustworthy experience to our citizens, but also to the globe, that we are very committed towards making sure that data protection and privacy is an important cog in our journey for digitization.
Right. So a big thank you to all our viewers for asking such immense and important questions. And a big thank you, sir, to you, Mr. Vishal Salvi, for your expertise and your insights, and for breaking it down so beautifully well from the senior leadership to even the individuals to understand and include and incorporate this in their future. So I hope it was, and I'm sure it was, very insightful to everybody watching, and it has shed a big light on how the DPDPA would shape their way of working as well. So with that, we conclude today's webinar with immense and intriguing insights from Sir. So remember, data privacy isn't just a regulation, but it's a responsibility we all share. So stay informed, stay secure, and keep cracking the code. Until next time, stay tuned for more such webinars. And this is Nida Farheen signing off.